Segment 4, ניקוד 1, ניקוד א'. את האונייה ישמרו. את האונייה ישמרו. During this segment, you'll develop the ability to explain what you expect a group of people may do in the future. Over time, you'll discover several ways in which Hebrew can express the future tense. One of the most prominent of these is by means of a conjugation known as the yiktol conjugation. The yiktol conjugation. Take, for example, the expression yishmeru. Combined in just a single word in Hebrew, it translates as the phrase, they will guard, yishmeru. Within that particular conjugated verb form, you may notice the fundamental consonants, or the shoresh, consisting of shin, mem, resh. You'll probably recognize that shoresh routinely conveys something to do with guarding, and sure enough, yishmeru means they will guard. In order to become comfortable with other verbs which express this sense of they will, a group of people doing something in the future, let's look at a list of a variety of verbs, each of which is conjugated to mean they will do something or other. So you see before you, yichretu, they will cut. Yimlechu, they will rule. Yimtsu'u, they will find. Yishkavu, they will lie down. Yishma'u, they will hear. Yishmeru, they will guard. Listen to them once more, strictly a cascade of the verbs, and listen in particular for the similarity of the vowel sounds. Yichretu, yimlechu, yimtsu'u, yishkavu, yishma'u, yishmeru. Each of these carries a meaning of they will, followed by whatever is the specific activity of the verb in question. Please read over the paragraph directly below this array of verbs so that you can isolate the particular features which distinguish the third masculine plural of the yiktol conjugation. Have you noticed that certain consonants in certain situations tend to modify or elide or disappear? For example, the nun that ends the preposition min is rather vulnerable, sometimes disappearing, sometimes leaving a dagesh in its vacancy. This sort of change can take place in verbs as well. Let's take a look at the appendix section corresponding to this segment to get an idea of some of the changes which we may expect. Here is the appendix entry for segment 4, nikud 1, nikud alef. This segment will help you become comfortable with verbs which are not spelled exactly the same as the model provided in the main part of the textbook, that is, yishmeru. Begin by considering the fact that after the first shoresh consonant, after the first radical, which in the verb yishmeru would be the shin, after that first radical, the yiktol will routinely supply a shava in this third masculine plural conjugation. Once again, first radical followed by a shava. That's the first feature we want to concentrate on as we look for these alternative spellings. Here then is the situation. First radicals, which consist of consonants such as alef, yod, or nun, behave a little differently when they land in a situation calling for a shava immediately following. We're talking then about verbs whose first consonant is going to be aleph. Think, for example, of achal, to eat. It starts with aleph. Consequently, when they should normally be followed by a shava, as this third masculine plural conjugation would dictate, they're going to behave slightly differently. Please study each example that you see in the table that follows in order to learn how they accommodate this particular conjugation. Here are several examples of verbs with either an aleph, yod, or nun in the first shoresh consonant position, known as the first radical. Notice how they produce the third masculine plural in this conjugation known as yiktol. The verb achal, meaning to eat, renders it yochalu, yochalu, they will eat. The verb amar, to say, renders it yomeru, yomeru, they will say. Yarad, to descend, yeredu, yeredu, they will descend. Yashav, to sit, renders it yeshavu, yeshavu, they will sit or dwell. The case of halach is slightly different in that it does not begin with either aleph, yod, or nun. It begins with a hey, but it behaves as if it were a first yod verb, so it is included here. Halach, to walk, becomes yelechu, yelechu, they will walk. Nafal is a first nun verb, meaning to fall. It becomes yippalu, yippalu. Notice the dagesh in the pei, the remnant of the first nun, which was lost. Nasa also is first nun, meaning to lift. It becomes yisa'u, yisa'u. In the case of nasa, we would expect there to appear a dagesh in the sin, recalling the lost nun of nasa, just as we found a dagesh in the pei of nafal, recalling the lost nun. The fact that it does not appear is commented on in the parenthetical statement to the left. And finally, natan, again first nun, meaning to give. It becomes yitanu, yitanu, they will give. Notice the dagesh in the tav, recalling the lost nun of natan, the first nun of natan. It would be normal for a student looking at all this detail to wonder, is it necessary for me to master this at this time? In other words, to be able to correctly conjugate from memory any of these verbs. Well, while that is ideal, it may be a bit unreasonable at this point. A better pathway may be the following. Make note of the basic principle. That is, make note of those consonants which are vulnerable to change. Perhaps you'll want to jot these down somewhere in the flyleaf of your textbook or in some other note sheet for ready access. Namely, be aware that if a verb begins with a shoresh aleph, yod, nun, or the ones that follow, you want to be on the lookout and realize these might depart from, in fact, quite predictably, will depart from this standard conjugation spelling that you're learning in the major part of the textbook. Then, alert to that fact, you can come back to this portion of the appendix, check yourself, and make sure you're either composing correctly or reading and interpreting correctly, consistent with this information. In addition to aleph, yod, and nun, here are some more consonants. These are gutturals. Admittedly, aleph was a guttural. He was in the first table because he behaved slightly differently, but here are hey, chet, and ayin, which by virtue of being gutturals are also going to change the spelling slightly. Yachshavu, yachshavu, ya'avdu, ya'avdu, ya'amdu, ya'amdu. Take time to look over this and then jot these consonants down in your ready reference section so that you can learn to anticipate they will be spelled slightly differently. Over time, you'll come to be able to predict what those spellings are with repeated exposure. There are two remaining clusters of verbs which accommodate their spelling based on the content of their shoresh. Hollow verbs are one of these. And by hollow verbs, we're referring to verbs whose middle consonant, middle shoresh consonant, middle radical, is either a vav or an yod. Please notice how these accommodate their spelling, and it's influenced by the fact that their middle radical is either vav or yod. Yavo'u, yavo'u. Yamutu, yamutu. Yasuru, yasuru. Yakumu, yakumu. Yasimu, yasimu. The last cluster of verbs involves verbs which contain a yod or a hey as their third radical. By reviewing how these verbs behave, we discover that the third yod or hey is simply too frail, too weak to persist, so it disappears. Listen then to how these verbs read in the third masculine plural form. Yivku, yivku. Yihyu, yihyu. Yichyu, yichyu. Yir'u, yir'u. Yishtu, yishtu. That wraps up the variables that you want to be aware of. The good news is these kinds of changes are not unique to the third masculine plural. They obtain here, but they won't be unique. You will find these obtaining in other situations with these radicals as well. So what you're beginning to learn here, it seems like minuscule detail, it will pay dividends with other conjugation forms as well. And now let's consider the important question. In a verb such as yishmeru, where is the pronoun they? We've acknowledged it should be translated they will guard, but where is the pronoun they? The answer to this question is this. The pronoun they is contained within that specific third masculine plural verb spelling or conjugation. In fact, when no explicit subject is supplied, meaning in the phrase or in the sentence within which you discover this verb, if no explicit subject is supplied, we should, in fact, we must supply the pronoun they in our translation. On the other hand, as soon as a specific subject appears or is supplied in the text we're reading, we must use that explicit subject rather than supplying a pronoun. So please notice these examples. Yishmeru. Notice that this is presented before you as a sentence, and there is no explicit subject provided. There's no indication of malachim, there's no indication of avadim. Nothing in the environment is giving you explicit subject. Consequently, we must supply the pronoun they. They will guard. Are we permitted to supply any other pronoun, such as he will guard, I will guard, she will guard, you will guard? The answer is no. This spelling allows only the pronoun they to be supplied. And that's the beauty of the precision of Hebrew. Now move please to the second example sentence. Yishmeru ha'avadim. Yishmeru ha'avadim. This is translated, as you see, the servants will guard. Some mistakenly suppose that since Yishmeru alone can offer the pronoun they as subject, some make the mistake early on in studying Hebrew of translating Yishmeru ha'avadim as this, they the servants will guard. This is not a correct translation. We must in this situation refrain from employing the implicit subject they, since we are supplied with an explicit subject, the servants. Once again, this should not be translated, they the servants will guard, but rather, the servants will guard.